Welcome, everyone. We are going to let people come into the room now. And we're happy that you're here today for this seminar sponsored by the Department of Environment and Society at Utah State University. We're very pleased today to have a great panel discussion and presentation. And let's start with a few mechanics as people come in, and then we will do the formal introduction. We would like you to use the question and answer function in Zoom to submit questions for the panelists. We'll save the questions until the end and then let them address them after they've given their presentation. If you're having any difficulties at all with the Zoom functionality and need any assistance, Josie Tollefson is our coordinator from Academic and Instructional Services, and she's here to help you. So please communicate with her individually in the chat function if you need any help. And we'll use those functionalities of Zoom in that way. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We're very, very happy to have this presentation today that has been organized and led by Sarah Klain. Sarah is a faculty member in our Department of Environment and Society, and she actually is the Andrew J. Senti Assistant Professor of Ecosystem Services. She considers herself and has been trained as an ecological economist and a conservation scientist. Her expertise and her perspectives are broad, and so those categories themselves don't fully capture all that she contributes to our department. We're very, very happy that she's pulled this presentation together for us today. And she is going to introduce the rest of her panel. But the topic today, as you see from our title slide, is supporting reverence, regeneration, and resilience, weaving knowledge for tribal stewardship of the Boa Ogoi massacre site. The special feature of this presentation is it is a very local place-based issue related to the valley and the location that Utah State is in. So we're happy to hear about this issue, and we're very excited for your presentation. I'll turn it over to you, Sarah.
Okay, Joanna, if you could stop sharing your screen, and then I will share my screen.
Go.
Great. Thanks, Joanna, for that introduction. Let me just get my slides working here. Okay. Oops, not share. Wrong button. Present. Okay. Give that a second. All right, can everybody see my slide? Thumb up? Yes, okay. Thanks again, Joanna, for inviting me to talk. And I felt the need to have many of my collaborators here talking with me because this work that we're doing at its DNA is collaborative. And I wanted to emphasize that in how we present our research and our collaboration. So I'm really lucky to have other people here. And just to put this in a little bit of context, given the ENVS speaker series that we're having, in February, Tristan Atone and Robert Lee, they presented, their talk was on how the financial foundations of land-grant universities are largely based on money raised by seizing land from indigenous people and or paying pennies on the dollar to tribes for land parcels. So because of this, my view is that land-grant institutions, including Utah State, I really think we have a moral duty to support tribal initiatives when that university support is desired by the band or the tribe or the coalition of tribes. So all of this has motivated me to collaborate on what I think is a really fascinating project. It's very interdisciplinary. It's very rich in how we're looking at relationships between different kinds of people and land and envisioning a better future. So I'm gonna briefly introduce Will Munger. He is right here, and he is a PhD student in ENVS. And Will was the first student to tell me about the Ogoi project, or Ogoi. There's actually a little bit of debate about pronunciation, but it was through Will and his team of climate adaptation science students. I was the studio instructor for their class, and this student group selected to work on this project, and I was fascinated from the beginning because of the different layers of meaning and significance and science that are all woven together and embedded in this place. It's also a study site that is nearby. So I feel like it's pretty important to develop projects in the place where you live. And also for me personally, not being from this area, I wanted to learn more about the history, both human and natural, of this place. And I have learned so much about the history of this place through getting involved in this project. So Will Munger is doing his part of his PhD research related to this effort. And then I also have a master's student, Cole Stalker, who's here today. And in addition to being a local rock star, he is also working on his master's thesis, interviewing nearby land managers about how they relate to the land in that area and the watershed. And he's going to provide a little bit more information about his work later on. And also, of course, and I really want to emphasize how this collaboration is possible largely because of Darren Perry. So Darren Perry is on this. He's going to talk in just a moment. Darren, if you haven't heard him speak already, he is a highly respected leader of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. I also think that Darren, he can win over just about anyone with his smile and profound storytelling abilities. So Darren is a leader. He is an author. He is a historian. He's a father. He's a storyteller. He wears all sorts of hats. And he's been a source of inspiration for me working on this project. And I'm really grateful that we get to collaborate with Darren and the tribe on this. And I've learned already so much, even though I feel like our voyage has just begun. So I urge you to read his book and also just, listen to his knowledge and wisdom about the past, the history of this place, and also the vision for the future of Ogoi. So without further ado, Darren, it would be great if you could lead the next part.
Thank you very much for having me. Let me just start by giving a land acknowledgement, if that's okay. Utah State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. The university resides on land ceded in the 1863 treaty at Fort Bridger. But we also recognize the 8 indigenous federally recognized tribes in Utah, the historic indigenous communities that reside in Utah, indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. So, the big question, how do we begin to address issues of cultural and environmental change? And how do we begin to take back this lost narrative? For me, it's always about giving people a voice. You need to understand the past and the viewpoints of many people who have made it over the centuries. American Indians must be included as a central strand in the history of the United States. Our historical experiences require us to look beyond the stereotypes and rethink some basic assumptions we've had about history. It's human nature for us to believe that our story is the story. The danger, though, of carrying that view is that we become calcified in our own echo chambers and we stay insulated from groups that parrot back our own confirmed biases. I've come to realize in my lifetime that when we reduce history to just data, and when we remove the storytelling, or the emotional side, we lose some of the humanity that makes history so important. But that's why our story is important. For thousands of years, tribal elders would sit down with the young children and tell them stories. And these stories were always the same. There was never a word out of place. It had to be that way. It had to be accurate. Our children needed to hear the stories as the elders had heard the stories, because in my culture, nothing was ever written down. I went through this process with this beautiful woman right here, May Timbimbu Perry. She was so gentle and kind. She would sit for hours and tell me stories about how the coyote stole fire or how the porcupine became greedy. And then with reverence in her tone and sometimes a tear in her eye, she would relate the story of the massacre of Ogoi. There's an old Indian saying that says, when an old Indian dies, a library burns. And that was never as true as it was about my grandmother. It was here that my grandmother taught me to be thankful for the teachings of my people. She taught me that this land is sacred. The water and the plants that were used as food and medicines were equally as sacred. She would say, slow down, listen, and ponder the lessons that are being taught. There is a great natural order to the universe of which man is a part. We've been endowed with the ability to observe and learn and imitate this order. It is a relationship of giving and taking, reciprocity. I believe that ancient tribal cultures have important lessons to teach the rest of the world about how all living things are connected, and the fact that our very existence is dependent upon this natural world that we seem to be destroying today. Native people have always possessed a profound spiritual kinship with nature. Pre-Columbus America was always our first Eden. Native people were transparent in this ecosphere. All of our decisions consider the effects of our actions on the generations to come. We do not live in this space anymore. Colonization has taken its toll, but we need to start for the sake of our children and our grandchildren and those generations yet unborn. Yet in spite of all these challenges, we have survived and adapted, and in some cases thrived. Our ability to adapt to this changing landscape has allowed us to remain. My Shoshone people are indigenous to this land. We lived like our forefathers had lived for thousands of years. We were hunters and gatherers. We traveled with the changing seasons. We referred to ourselves as Niwa, which means the people. We looked upon the earth as not just a place to live, but something so sacred and special that we called her mother. She was always the provider of our livelihoods. The delicate balance in which the Shoshone managed land and water resources for thousands of years was drastically altered by colonization. By the mid-1800s, the Oregon and California trails brought thousands of pioneers and gold-seeking miners through the very center of Shoshone ancestral lands. In 1855, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints colonized lands north of Salt Lake City and settled here in this beautiful Cache Valley on the Utah-Idaho border. But in establishing these settlements, those settlers plowed up precious seeds and grasslands that were used as a food source. And they diverted water for irrigation that caused a shift in this delicate ecosystem that we lived, much like our predecessors had done for 300 years. This lack of understanding between two cultures and the shortage of the resources caused conflict over the land and water and food. This conflict eventually led to the Bear River Massacre, which I believe is the largest massacre of Native Americans in the history of our country. The events that took place on that cold January morning in 1863 have long been forgotten by most. Maybe guilt or remorse has silenced all those who one day may have wanted to know the truth. But I believe, as I speak to a variety of groups, that there's a new generation being born that really have a desire to listen and to learn. And it's not because we're looking to have things made right, but I believe that those who died at Bear River that day have a God-given right to be heard. Their voices speak to me from the dust. My grandmother would tell me, if you're there at just the right time in the evening, you can sit and you can hear the cries of the little ones. Your senses tell you that you're among the spirits of more than 400 children of that great spirit who created us all. You don't have to see things as they were to know that a terrible injustice had taken place. There's a feeling there. But we remember and we honor the past because it allows us to succeed in the future. I've always believed that the most successful Native Americans today are those who can best balance culture and change. We honor our culture. We honor those who have gone before. They are important to us. We honor them and their traditions. But as a tribal leader, I've realized that we live in an ever-changing world. And it's my job to prepare our youth to change and succeed with it. Tell me a fact and I will learn. Tell me a truth and I will believe. But tell me a story and that will live in my heart forever. Ultimately, this story of the Bear River Massacre is our story. And in some ways, I hope you can respect the story that we want to have told, as well as recognize your role within this story. History doesn't always affirm us. Sometimes history challenges us to think about an uglier past that we would rather not have. But that's really the power and the benefit of history. It connects us to the past, and it connects us to our humanity and our inhumanity. But it always offers us a way to move forward, especially in a circumstance like this and now with the Shoshone people and Utah State University. Moving forward in a story that connects us, not in the prettiest of ways sometimes, but to move forward to this new relationship that is a 21st century relationship based on respect. Respect for the truth and what happened in that past moment. Then, that is when you get the possibility for real reconciliation. In 2018, we were able to purchase 550 acres of that sacred burial ground. This is only the beginning of a journey that began more than a century and a half ago, after the final shot was heard echoing through the Preston Valley. This partnership between our nation and the science community at Utah State University has just begun, and it will take years to accomplish. This, I believe, will be a living, learning classroom for years to come. It will require more than removing non-native plants and trees and planting new ones. It will involve restoring the watershed, which will require buy-in from our farmers and neighbors upstream. We've realized that this is not a project that we can do alone. And as my good friend that's going to present today, Will Munger, has said, healing begins when you bring people together. And I'm so honored to be a part of this group, Sarah, and thank you for having me today.
Thanks, Darren. That gave me goosebumps. I really appreciate you sharing your wise words and your reflections and thoughts on this. So, yeah, our collaboration, and as Will said, it's about bringing people together. And I had a conversation recently with Darren and Will, and we sat down and we were trying to think about ways to really put big picture description of what we're doing together. And Darren emphasized how healing is really central to the work that we're doing. And we think about this healing in relation to the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Nation, their history in this land and in this region. And we're also thinking about healing the relationship between the band and USU, which has been fraught in the past. And there's a lot of room for improvement to make this relationship better. And we also want to think really deeply about how this Boa Ogoi or Bia Ogi location, how it can be a demonstration for ways of improving how we relate to a landscape and how we re-embed Indigenous culture into a particular place in ways that can be shared with broader audiences. So this healing element is part of everything that we're doing. And there's also this notion of resilience. We want to try to incorporate resilience thinking into how we think about land and stewardship planning, particularly in the context of a changing climate where it's going to get hotter and drier. So we want to build a stewardship plan that can adapt to increases in temperature and less precipitation. We also want to think about resilience in the human way, like the resilience of the Shoshone Nation, the resilience of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. So regeneration is also part of what we're thinking about. We want to apply regenerative land management techniques. We want to restore endemic species and plants and animals that are important to the tribe. And also think about this regeneration as regenerating relationships, social relationships and relationships to the land. And reverence is also key and foundational to our collaboration together. Reverence for the past and reverence for what has been lost, but also an appreciation of what we are gaining and what we can accomplish together. So our research and collaboration is also based on ideas. You'll see in the background of this blue circle, there is a braid. And that braid comes from a metaphor that Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote about. She is an Indigenous scholar. She wrote about braiding sweetgrass and braiding knowledge in her fantastic book, which I highly recommend. It's beautifully written. And we are applying this braiding idea to braiding together Indigenous knowledge, Western scientific knowledge, and local knowledge in order to support the development of Bia Ogi and to develop a stewardship plan. So we want a stewardship plan that can enable the band to meet its goals, both in the short term and in the long term. And I like this conceptual diagram created by Tango et al. For the 5 required tasks for successful collaboration across different types of knowledge systems. So we've got different epistemologies going on here. We have different worldviews, and we have to figure out how to mobilize the local knowledge, the Indigenous knowledge, the Western scientific knowledge demonstrated in that mobilize topic up there. And then the people who have this knowledge need to figure out how to talk to each other, how to translate knowledge, how to learn from each other. And then there's this negotiation process. There might be ways in which these different types of knowledges align and other ways in which the knowledges do not line up. So there's this negotiation process, and then it's going to be synthesized and then applied. And in this particular context, we want to do the synthesis and application for creating and implementing a land stewardship plan as part of developing Bia Ogi. So we've assembled this team, and it's a team of faculty, students, and tribal partners. We want to co-create this Bia Ogi stewardship plan, and we also want to create a blueprint for university tribal collaborations for land stewardship that can be useful for other people in other locations. So let's dive into this knowledge braiding. I'm going to have Will start out talking about some Indigenous knowledge that's been documented and then applied to Western scientific knowledge models. And then Cole will tell you a bit about his interviews with locals to kind of mobilize their local knowledge to contribute to this stewardship planning process. So Will, take it away.
So we were really lucky when we began this process because Darren had recently published his book on the Bear River Massacre. And in that book, he included a series of plant diaries that May Timbimbu Perry had created that really well documented different types of plants that were important to the Shoshone, where they grew and how they were used. And so when we were thinking about how do we conceptualize weaving together these different sort of knowledges to support a climate adapted stewardship plan, we began with this indigenous knowledge. As you can see here on the left, these are some of the initial sketches that May made. And we tried to think about also what was the land like? What was the land? How could you read this landscape? And what you're seeing in this image is kind of the rough outline of where the center is going to be in Southeast Idaho. And what you can see all around it is these center pivots, stockyards, canals and irrigation infrastructure. There's a lot of neighbors, and those neighbors' land management practices shape what the ecology on the site is. And in particular, water quality, which is something that is going to be a real limiting factor in terms of what is possible at this site. And so when we thought about bringing together this Western scientific knowledge, we happened to be located at the Quincy School of Natural Resources and have some of the best ecologists and watershed scientists around. So we're really also lucky to be proximate to a lot of the research that has gone into everything from process-based restoration to endangered fish restoration to modeling around climate change. So in particular, we looked at a projected climate change model, the CMIP-5 model, and downscaled it to the particular area where the site is. A lot of this modeling was done by Sofia Kazukos, who is one of our collaborators in the Climate Adaptation Science program and also a PhD student here. She went a further step and combined these downscaled climate models to species distribution models, which look at how the distribution of species might change based on different climate change scenarios. And if you've never heard of models before, all it is a theory of how the world works. Climate models are mixes of physical models, and species distribution models take ecological data and try to think about what are the statistical predictors of what affects that. And we also looked at a GIS model, and this was originally run by Lindsay Caputo, who you can see down here on the right, as well as Kyle Totticini. And this process-based restoration is a watershed restoration approach that was adapted here at Utah State. Folks like Joe Wheaton and Wally McFarlane and a lot of others who I'm forgetting to recognize have done a lot of work to create these GIS models to look at where beaver restoration might be possible. Other scientific knowledge that we've done is looking at how water is moving across the landscape. What you're looking at here is a wetland delineation map that was done by our partners at BioWest, looking at how water is moving through this landscape. And then assessing the current ecological conditions was a big part of what we've been trying to do during the COVID pandemic, because a lot of the social science research we've had some trouble with. But we were able to fly a lot of drones, and we got some good shots here. What you're seeing on the top is where what's known as Beaver Creek to the Shoshone is currently called Battle Creek. We call it the Beaver Battle Creek because it's one of the main sites that there's a lot of restoration possibility there. And this photo shows why that is so important, because what you're looking at is the sediment load from Beaver Creek as it flows into the Bear River. You can see that brown stripe there on the bottom. This is sediment, agricultural nutrients that are coming into the Bear River system. This changes the biogeochemistry, affects the different fish that are able to live there. And there's a lot of people, farmers, ranchers, Pacific Corps, water managers who are interested in cleaning up these tributaries and improving water quality. You can see on this bottom slide the incision of Beaver Creek. So what was once likely a wide delta that supported biodiversity, willows, cottonwoods, bird species, is now kind of a glorified irrigation ditch and has been channelized and incised to maximize water runoff, and which is not conducive to the restoration goals of the Shoshone. So I'll talk a bit about these downscale climate projections real quick. First, to think kind of about how climate change will play out on the ground, there's a lot of interest in these downscale projections because we know globally what climate change might mean, but there's a lot of interest in what does this mean for local municipalities or indigenous governments or conservation districts. So these downscaled models are a way that people are trying to think through this. So when we look at something like evapotranspiration or projected runoff or surface air temperature, these models help us think through these different relative concentration pathway scenarios, which is how much greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere and how much might that affect something like water runoff. And if you look at that top right graph, where you can see is under an RCP 8.5 scenario, which is kind of the worst possible climate change scenario, there's potentially a lot more runoff, which means that when we're sizing everything from culverts going under roads or the shape of channels, we need to think about, well, if we have a really bad climate change scenario, do we need to change some of the engineering on that and think about how the site can be resilient to these bigger changes? Similarly, if surface air temperature or evapotranspiration is changing, how might that affect the plants that are possible to be planted on the site? And so that's where these species distribution models really come in. And so what we did as a team is take the plants identified in May Timbimbu Perry's plant diary, combine them with records of settlers of some of the grasses that might have first been here, as well as natural history, and create a database of these different species, and then look using these species distribution models at how those species might change under different climate change scenarios. And then what you're seeing here is a vulnerability index. And so a species like arrowleaf balsam root might experience a decrease in their territory, whereas something like camas under a particular RCP might do better. And so we've split it into forbs, grass, and trees under RCP 4.5 on top and RCP 8.5 on the bottom. And remember, if models are just theories about the world, we don't necessarily know this is going to be this way or that way. In a translational ecology, data is going back and forth between these different stakeholders. So really the next step in this project is for us to sit down as a team and think through, well, what are the implications of these models? How might this affect some of the planning that we're doing? Another way that we thought about using scientific knowledge to inform this restoration is these beaver restoration analysis tools. This is a GIS model that looks at stream power, slope, vegetation, proximity to human infrastructure to think about where beavers historically might have been in the system and where they might currently be or not be. And so if you think back to the issue of sedimentation in the watershed, if we can help reintroduce beaver to the watershed, there's a growing body of evidence showing that beavers can help clean up water, create more structural complexity in the system, and improve habitat for species like Bonneville cutthroat trout, which are endangered and the Shoshone would like to see return. And so this map was created by Kyle Todicini and shows some of the places that beavers or beaver dam analogs might be appropriate to help trap some of this sediment and help clean up the water. And finally, this is kind of a restoration that was done, or a rendering that was done by All Red Restoration, which is also one of our partners, looking at moving from the top scenario, which is what it is now, to the bottom scenario, which is where it might be, where we have created that habitat, that structural complexity. There's more willows, there's more cottonwoods, there's more habitat for fish and birds. And we're able to help create an area on Beaver Creek that might have looked like and invokes the feeling of what it was like when this was a historical Shoshone winter encampment. So that said, I will pass it over to Cole.
Cool, thanks, Will. So my research involves interviewing people local to the Battle Creek region where the Boa Ogoi site is located. As you can see here, local knowledge refers to the informal, lay, personal, often implicit or tacit, but possibly expert knowledge held by land managers involved in environmental decision making. What does that mean? It can be multi-generational. It's not limited to specific groups or inhabitants who have ancestral roots to an area, such as indigenous knowledge. But local knowledge can pertain to land management practices, invasive species management, and agricultural methods. And it can further be used to find solutions to problems caused by agricultural pollution, road construction, grazing, water diversion, and destruction of riparian areas by livestock, which are very common problems in the West, and they are problems at the site currently. There are many families who have lived and worked the land in this area specifically for some over 4 generations. And my interviews have focused on further understanding the unique perspectives held by these people that are making a living farming and ranching and managing the land, especially when it comes to the proposed restoration objectives at Ogoi. And I'd like to find and identify potential conflicts that may arise with these objectives moving forward. And further, I'm particularly interested in how local knowledge informs how these individuals they relate to the land and the species it contains. So to quote from a paper authored by Dr. Klain, relational values are values linking people and ecosystems via tangible and intangible relationships to nature, as well as principles, virtues, and notions of a good life that may accompany these. Let's see, as you can see from some quotes on this slide, there they are. From my preliminary research, I found that interviews in this area particularly valued caring for the land for future generations, as well as good stewardship and being a good steward of the land, as well as just there's memories associated with the species on this land. Next slide, please, Sarah. So a few specific cases. One person I talked to preferred chokecherries over Russian olive trees in the river bottoms. And this isn't because of like an economic or ecological benefit, but there were fond memories of picking chokecherries and elderberries with their grandmother to make jam as a kid. And so they prefer having those there instead. And another guy told me he despised beaver because he considered them to be dirty and a nuisance, but he had fond memories of dynamiting their dams with his father as a kid. So that was kind of interesting. And you know, overall, like the tribe values the land as sacred. It's their ancestral home, and locals value the site because it's a historical site of the Bear River Massacre. So by understanding these relational values and the roles and responsibilities these individuals subscribe to as a result, I'm hoping my research will kind of better inform the overall stewardship plan at the site, and really, most importantly, strengthen the relationship between the tribe and their neighbors. Because if this project becomes like a catalyst for like larger scale watershed restoration in this region, this strong working relationships can be really important with these neighboring landowners for sustained success. So that's all I have, Sarah.
Thanks, Cole. Yeah. So Cole's work, Will's work, our collaboration with Darren, we have these strands of knowledge. We have this indigenous knowledge, this Western scientific knowledge, and local knowledge that we're trying to braid together. And we have some upcoming, both ongoing and proposed additional work that is pretty cool and I'm very excited about. Just recently, Will installed some sensors into the river, and we're going to use data collected from these instruments to try to validate and correct or modify or better understand these climate models and what they mean for this particular landscape. There's also an ongoing collaboration with the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation and Brianne Litz that's called the
Degwa Day.
Degwa Day, the Degwa Day collaboration that's really about place-based storytelling and generating these place-based storytelling experiences, potentially for visitors to the cultural center that will be built on this site. We also have, we are all on this team, I think food is playing a central role to understanding the history of this place. And also food is part of figuring out a way to have this place connect to concepts that we want to move forward, including the idea of food sovereignty. So we've got Patrick on board to do some food sovereignty collaborative research with the tribe. And also many of you might have seen the film Gather that was shown at for ENVS. And we really want to use some of those ideas from that film and collaborate with the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Nation to advance these food sovereignty concepts and potentially use Ogoi or Ogoi as a place to cultivate foods important for the tribe. And who knows, maybe we can even bring some bison for visits to the site. These are all ideas that we have. There's also this idea of using biochar, which is particularly interesting. And Claudia Riddell reminded me that biochar is an indigenous practice that people of Amazonia practiced for millennia, pre-Columbian. So before Western colonization occurred, biochar was this indigenous practice that had, landscape-wide enormous impacts on soil quality for Amazonia. And we could test out doing some smaller scale biochar kiln pyrolysis on site and get rid of some invasive trees, including Russian olive, turn them into biochar and bury it to enhance soil carbon. So that's an exciting idea that's kind of budding. And then we also are doing, as I mentioned, this climate model validation and calibration using stream gauges. And we want to install a weather station to come up with this local, very localized data to inform efforts to steward this land. So big picture, I really hope our presentation has clarified how we are weaving knowledge to support healing when it comes to Indigenous history, healing when it comes to USU's relationship with an Indigenous group, and also healing when it comes to thinking about how we want to relate to land, what we want to see in the landscape, how we want to support endemic species, regenerate and restore some of that abundance that was here before settlers came in. And we're using these underlying ideas of resilience, regeneration, and reverence as we approach our collaborative relationship and moving forward. So I want to acknowledge not just Darren, but others in the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation, particularly Brad Perry, a project manager. The Climate Adaptation Science NRT program was also foundational for making this project flourish. I want to acknowledge the GEM Seed program that I've been part of, and also Jack Green, who introduced me to a lot of these people and this place. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. And I just want to hand it over to Darren to say some final words before we do the Q&A.
Let me just say thank you to Sarah and Will and Cole, who I consider dear, dear friends. And this journey that we're on is really pretty powerful. And so, the reality of finally being able to tell our story from our unique perspective is important. The purchase of the Bear River Massacre site will help our people reconnect to this sacred space while providing a new emphasis as stewards, something that was always important to my people. Voices that have been quiet for a long time are now going to be heard. Alliances that we formed between the business communities and Utah State University will help bring back what we thought was lost forever. We couldn't have done this by ourselves. The knowledge isn't there. And so, but as important as this, habitat restoration is, the preservation of our people and the stories that we tell are equally as important. It's only through the telling of oral history and oral stories are we going to be able to heal. We're just now being able, with your help, to begin to take back this narrative, which has been lost forever. And this is our story. And with your help, we will be heard. So thank you to all of you, and especially thank you to Utah State University for hosting us. And I hope you have some questions for the panel. It's an honor for me to be associated with such bright minds that it's just been a good experience for me. And so with that, Sarah, let's open it up to questions and see if we can answer a couple.
Maybe I need to stop sharing that. I'm just hunting for the Q&A. Okay. Q&A.
Cool. Okay, so there's a question from Jack here about the USU Native American Student Council. And we've been really grateful for the collaboration that we've had with them. They helped co-sponsor the Gather film. And there's a couple cool developments this summer that I also want to give a shout out, because there's opportunities for any students who are watching today to get involved. So we're teaming up with the Research Experience for undergraduates, as well as the Native American and STEM mentoring program to, in a hopefully post-COVID environment, have field days where we're doing plant and animal surveys. Jack, maybe you could help lead some of those bird surveys. And also thinking about taking some of this initial baseline data around soil health, water health. And so if there are students who are interested in getting involved, please hit us up. We're really excited to get a lot of younger students involved in doing research on the ground and involved in this project.
Jack, it would be fantastic if you wanted to donate your extensive library on Native Americans. I need to read more of that, and I've read, some of the regional work on that topic, but I have much left to learn, so we could benefit from that library. And Darren, maybe you could speak to this question. What is the projected completion date for the amphitheater?
Well, we hope to begin the amphitheater this spring, weather permitting. And so our goal is to have the amphitheater done by fall. So the next memorial service we hold on January 29th will be able to be held at the amphitheater that overlooks the sacred grounds. So that's our goal. And so stay tuned.
All right, I really encourage more questions. We have a lot of different kinds of knowledges represented here, so don't be shy. Okay, Frank Howe, once we have a restoration plan in place, how can we get band members as well as students involved? We have lots of ideas for that. Hopefully, Will or somebody else can have that be their full-time job of coordinating people to get involved in this restoration. So, Will, why don't you speak to that?
Sure. Frank, I think this is one of the most important questions, is supporting the next generation, being the stewards of this landscape. Some of the ways that we're thinking about that. So in the Deguade project, there's a real emphasis on youth interviewing elders and collecting this oral history. We're right now thinking about how we can host some of those events on the site itself. So Shoshone youth can be interviewing Shoshone elders on that site about this knowledge, and also be able to support Shoshone youth becoming scientists in their own ways and combining their own knowledges about this. And so in some of the grants that we're working on right now, there's everything from a data sovereignty stipend to think about supporting tribal data management and supporting youth gaining those data management skills, as well as some of the field work and ecology skills. But I just think this is the most important thing, and it's really where a lot of the synthesis between the Ogoi restoration work and the Deguade cultural and technological work really overlap. So I have been really lucky this spring to be in Brianne Litz's class, as well as some of the other collaborators from the team. And so we're just learning a lot in these partnerships. Oh, the PBR logo, that would be a Wheaton Lab.
Process-based restoration. Yeah. Yeah.
If you come to a Beaver workshop, you can even get a sticker.
Yeah. And Darren, maybe you can address this question from my dad who logged on. Does the tribe hope to do any archaeological work within their values? And I know there has been previous archaeological work there, but I know you can speak better to that question than I can.
Yeah. The first question, we don't have anything planned, and for a couple of reasons. And let me speak to the last question, and then I'll explain my first one. Some work has been done by Ken Cannon, who is he's not a stranger to Utah State University. And so they received a grant to do archaeological work on a site that was not close to the massacre site. Some historians thought that that's where it was at, and it wasn't. And so very little was found other than old farming equipment and things of that nature. But we're not planning anything directly. My grandmother would take me to the site as a young boy, and we'd sit and she'd point where the lodges were located, where the troops forced the Shoshones to the river, and where almost all of the killing took place. She had been at the same site with her grandfather, Dabuzi, who was 12 years old during the massacre, who showed her the same things. And so we have a perfect knowledge of where those things were at from survivors that lived through it. And so knowing that, we don't have any intentions of even disturbing a dirt clod on the site. Some of our tribal elders are really adamant about us not disturbing the landscape. And so when we build this interpretive center and walking trails down to the hot springs, we need to be very careful on the ground that we're going to be doing that on. And so we've made, we're just making sure that we stay away from those sacred areas. And so no future work will be done. There's an old tribal elder that says all archaeologists can tell you is what they find, and they can't find everything. So their story is always incomplete. And those were words from a wise tribal elder who taught me a lesson one day, because I always thought, well, let's have them look, let's find out. And she taught me that beautiful lesson. And so no future work is planned on the site, maybe in some areas that are not as sensitive, but I can't see that going forward right now.
Thanks, Darren.
I see another question from Jack Green offering a canoe trip in mid-May. Yes, we should absolutely do that. You know, we've been getting a lot of interest in Franklin County. For example, the hot springs, Maple Grove Hot Springs, invited Darren up to share some of these stories earlier this year. They're interested in doing some of this restoration work and learning from some of the research that we've been doing. And so a canoe trip from Maple Grove Hot Springs down to Ogoi could be a pretty cool way to experience the Bear River and learn some of these stories along the way. So stay tuned, and Jack, we're going to take you up on that.
So I'd like to ask a question, and somehow because I host, I can't type it in, so I'm going to ask it live. So the knowledge braiding is very, very interesting. And the neighbors, working with neighbors. And there are a lot of other people in the landscape, and clearly people who own land adjoining and around, who move water, who conduct agricultural operations, who think and know the land in a different way. So I'm kind of curious what they think about the site and how willing they are to work on integrating knowledge and respecting the knowledge that you're surfacing.
So coal is really he's done these interviews with many of these landowners. And Cole, my impression from our conversation is that there's a lot of different attitudes. Some of these nearby landowners are friends with Darren. They've been, they've collaborated with him before. They share equipment. Like, there's good, solid relationships. And then there's a few, I won't name any names, but like a few others who like, really, they should just retire. Like, it's time for them to move over and, let the next generation manage the land. So yeah, it's a mix. And Cole, maybe you can speak to that diversity.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in working together and being involved. It seems like the old timers are a little bit cantankerous when it comes to traffic specifically. I hear a lot of that. Well, we don't want more cars coming through, that kind of thing. But what I'm finding is people are pretty knowledgeable of the site. They know what's going on up there. They want to be involved. They want they want to be heard in a sense. Like, there's this element of like, it's your land, you can do what you want with it, but also let's be good neighbors to each other kind of thing. In particular with species like beaver that are going to be possibly introduced to the area, or like some of the native species and things like this. I think people want to be informed and know, because beaver they don't like to stay in one area kind of thing. But then some of the species that want to they want to remove, like Russian olive, I think everybody's in agreement that they really don't like those. So I think it comes down to objective by objective basis on what people support and what they don't. But I think overall, especially among the younger crowd, I think people are really supportive of the project and want to be involved in some capacity. So.
And Cole, let me just add that I've spent a lot of years up there and developing these relationships with people, and I've never heard anything bad, but except with one farmer that I always hear bad from one farmer. But those of you who know me know how important it is to build bridges. And so my goal from day one is to make sure everyone in the community has a seat at the table, and how we can work together to make this a beautiful place that the world can come to. Keeping in mind traffic and change for some of those old timers is hard, and it is for some of us too. But I think for the most part, it's generally been accepted, because I've tried to include everyone in the process along the way, and I'm not leaving anyone behind. And so I think this work will just continue, and the collaboration process we've had with you at Utah State University is just second to none. It's been a blessing in my life. So.
Yeah, we've also been very much in planning mode with COVID-19, because it's just not safe to do that much in-person engagement. So I think once more people are vaccinated, by the way, Will and I are vaccinated, that's why we're in the same room. Once more people have been vaccinated, we want to do more, diverse stakeholder engagement, like in person, like walking the land, and thinking about ways in which, it might be project by project, but like removing Russian olive is very labor intensive in a short amount of time. So, who knows, maybe some neighbors will be willing to volunteer, and we can get to know them better as we attempt to like remove this exotic tree. But I think that, yeah, we're moving forward thinking about more and more in-person ways to engage local residents, and hopefully feel like their voices are heard. And as Cole mentioned, like, if this Ogoi project is a catalyst for larger watershed restoration, we absolutely need to get the neighbors engaged, all the upstream. Like, there's a lot of sediments, there's a lot of agricultural runoff right now. The way that people are using land upstream is not very good for biodiversity on site at Ogoi. So we gotta keep that collaboration building and strengthening those connections.
Like you have another question.
Yeah, so this is a really good question from anonymous attendee. Thank you for this. So the question is, in Sophia's climate models, it shows a bunch of the species could potentially experience pretty significant declines. And so the question is, has there been work to determine if there are non-historic species which would naturally benefit from a shifted climate at the site and may well migrate here anyway? And can these be transplanted to the site and provide the lost ecosystem services with the goal of increasing overall resiliency in a shifted climate? And so at the core, this is a question of how do you balance adaptation and resiliency? And, I oftentimes go to what Darren said earlier, about the successful peoples can balance tradition and change. And so when we're looking at this site, the feeling of the site really matters. We want the land to be able to speak to people and to speak to the Shoshone's long relationship with it. And so stories, for example, around the role of Willow as basket weaving and as an actor in the massacre story itself, Willow is really important. And so, Willow is one of those species that's potentially impacted by climate change. And right now I'm in the midst of propagating a lot of willow that are currently on that site to be used for planting. And I'm not sure exactly how those willow are going to do. And so I think this is the work of climate adaptation, right? Is this iterative process of once we have these collaborative relationships, we have these models that might inform how that might go down. But really, every year we need to be continuing to look and update and continuing to answer these questions because there's a lot of complexity, a lot of unknown between these different climate change scenarios. And one thing I will say is that we really need local leaders to step up and take action on climate change. And Darren, in his congressional run last year, made climate a core issue that he was communicating to rural Utah audiences about the importance of addressing climate change. And what we see in these climate change scenarios is the faster that we can mitigate and decrease greenhouse gas concentrations, the easier it will be to adapt. And so that's a really important takeaway moving forward.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, it's about what is possible on the landscape and what do people want. And the what do people want is a multi-stakeholder lot. We got to really talk with ecologists, botanists, and tribal members and local residents. And adapting to the climate will require, sometimes you have to make some trade-offs in deciding what to propagate and what not to, depending on anticipated changes. But yeah, I think, your question's really interesting, and it's really related to like what humans want on the landscape and trying to be very intentional about it. Yeah. I see we got a question about inventories of plants, insects, and other animals that currently inhabit the land. I think we will likely, there's this students in STEM, native students in science, technology, education, I can't remember the acronym. We were thinking about potentially getting some undergrad students to do some inventories of what is out there right now. And you've done a little bit of that.
Actually, Jack Green helped out, and he and I went out and did some bird surveys, and we found 24 different species of birds out there. And that's because Jack has a really good ear. But a lot of these species inventories have not been done. And it's a great opportunity to engage youth and elders to be on the land, learning about it, listening to it, figuring out what comes next. And so I think, we have all these ideas of, citizen science or science with society. These sort of collaborations, I think in a lot of ways are the future of science, and engaging people in learning together on the land. And that social learning, I think, is a key generative element of a project like this.
And Mark Brunson just updated me. It's the Native American Summer Mentorship Program. It's not just STEM, so it's broader than STEM. But I participated in that last year, and hopefully I will again. And hopefully we can get some of those students to get out to the site and start collecting more of this baseline data.
There's another question from Ellis about is there collaboration with other restoration projects with Indigenous groups? And this is something we're talking a lot about because over the last couple of years, at events that have been held at Utah State Life Restoring the West, some of Joe Wheaton's beaver restoration workshops. We've had Fish and Game agency staff from other nations like Shoshone-Bannock come and learn and be part of this. And so I think there is a lot of opportunity to compare, what makes a good collaboration? How do we structure these programs? And obviously, there's huge implications. Secretary Holland is going to be visiting the area very soon to think about these co-management intertribal coalitions, and the role of land-grant universities in these future science collaborations is really crucial. And so this feels like a really opportune time to think deeply about this, develop these relationships, and learn from each other. And so I'm really honored to be part of this institution and doing this.
Great. Well, that looks like you've had a chance to answer most of the questions that were submitted. We want to thank you very, very much for a very wonderful, meaningful, and inspiring presentation today. And we're glad to know about the work that you're doing and all the opportunities for people to be involved. So thank you. Thank you very much for being here today.
Yeah, and thank you, Joanna, for organizing a great series of talks. I feel like our project really connects to a lot of other talks during this seminar series. And I'm just so glad that we are having more prominent conversations in our department about these issues and figuring out how to move forward, building those relationships. Yeah, so thank you, Joanna, and thanks so much, Darren and Cole. Your work is great, and Will, couldn't do this without you. So again, yeah, thanks a lot.
Well,